Hello, my name is Tim Maynes, and I'm here representing the Center for Leadership and Organizational Effectiveness at the University of Buffalo School of Management with the latest installment of the 52 Weeks of Leadership. I'm here with Kevin Nephew, CEO of Seneca Gaming, and excited to have a conversation about leadership and how that might influence the climate and so on inside of an organization and culture related to being willing to speak up and share improvement-oriented ideas and to raise concerns and issues and so on. So very excited about it. So let's get started.
All right, Tim, thank you very much. Welcome to Seneca Gaming Corporation. You said it's the 52 Weeks of Leadership. One thing you'll look at in the month of November is Native American Heritage Month. So it's my pleasure to be here to also celebrate Native American Heritage Month this month.
Wonderful.
All right.
It's I think a great way to commemorate Native American Heritage Month and talk about speaking up in voice. You know, giving voice to people inside of organizations so that they have some level of influence over the policies and procedures and so on that impact their work experience. I'd like to start, if we could, with if any sort of thoughts come to your mind when we talk about employee voice, empowering employees to speak up and to share their thoughts and opinions and so on. If there are any specific examples from your own experience, either positive or could be not quite as positive, but in your own experience, examples of employees who have done that, shared their thoughts, and it's had an important effect on the organization.
Sure. I'll use an example, but one thing I'll kind of step back to is when we bring our team members in, one of the beauties of Seneca Gaming Corporation is that we're able to incorporate a lot of the beliefs of the Seneca Nation. And it's just, I can't say enough of what a blessing it is and what a great opportunity it is. And one of the beliefs we have is that everyone is the same height, right? And when you see that, you think about it, is that everyone's voice carries the same amount of power, the same importance. So regardless of how tall you might be, right, you would always think that somebody who's taller would have a larger voice, but the belief is that everyone has the same voice. And we bring that all the way through our new hire orientation with our newest team members. And the belief being that no matter where you are in the organization, it's important to have your voice. And I think a lot of times people really kind of get beaten down by it. It was interesting when you asked about when we've seen this. So one of the things we used to work with, and it was a department I absolutely love, and we still run it, is continuous improvement. And we always talk about doing things. I always believe it's real simple, right? Keep the world real simple. And it's just do things better, faster, and smarter. So one of our things is we would do what's called the Kaizen. We'd go in and we'd work with a group of individuals to look at how can they approach doing their jobs better, faster, smarter. So we go in and I'll never forget, we were in with our stewarding group. And our stewarding group, one of the folks, and he was a steward, and as he's looking at this and he goes, well, you want things to be better, faster, and smarter. He goes, I'll tell you how to do that. He goes, why do they have me putting in these dishes backwards? It's like, what? So he was loading up this dishwasher and he put in all the dishes backwards. So why the heck would you do that? Because even the instructions on the side of the machine said, do it the other way. And he goes, well, they told me to. It's like, they told you to. And I said, yeah, the person said at the time, and it was many, many years before, had said, if you put them the other way, they'll get cleaner. And he was like, but it tells me to do it the other way. So he looked at me and he goes, well, you're supposed to make changes? What do you want me to do? And I said, well, let's do this. I also believe it's important to be data driven. I said, well, let's do the dishes the way you've been told. We go and we run 100 dishes through. And I said, well, let's run them your way. Run them his way. So we run them the old way and get about 50% are clean. We run them his way and it's like 95%. He goes, well, what are we going to do? And I said, well, I think we're going to start doing them your way. And it made me realize that, the person that's doing the work knows the work better than anybody else. And it was funny, I think he was like shocked to think that you could make this just fundamental change. And people don't realize that unless you really value what their voice is and let them control it. Now, it doesn't mean you can do that every time, but that was a perfect example. So it worked out well, but it was a great opportunity to really work with the people who really are at our front line and able to see process improvements and work with them.
Yeah.
So it was a great point. I will use the other side though, Tim. It was kind of sad though, and I'm glad to do this because part of it is there's always a good and bad.
Mm.
That the people who kind of, well, everyone was worried that, oh, well, Lord knows we've been doing this all wrong the whole time. It's like, no, you can't really always look back and look for punishment. It's looking for the improvement opportunities. And that's what we really did. And then we went back through and that's what we did across the organization. Sounds kind of trivial, but at the same time, I think as you do that, people start to realize you're not just saying this, you're going to have to walk it. And two is um, your leaders will have to also accept that they're willing to make those changes.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, I love that example. And in the improvement in the cleanliness of the dishes and not having to do multiple batches to get the same set of dishes clean. And it brings to mind, from my own experience, before I became a professor, I worked in an accounting firm and saw similar things that, if employees share their thoughts and ideas, and then management doesn't respond or doesn't take it seriously, there can be like the development of what I would characterize as cynical attitudes. That, yeah, they say out of one side of their mouth that they want to hear from us, but at the same time, they don't really want to hear from us, and they're not really going to do anything anyway. So, to put myself out there and to raise an issue or to make a suggestion, it's not worth my time. So I've seen that. So another question comes to mind for me. Uh, over the years, you've risen through the ranks in leadership, and now you sit at an executive level. And I'm curious how the advice that you would give to someone, say someone's watching this video and they're a first-time leader, and they're saying to themselves, I really buy these ideas about the importance of allowing employees to speak up and to share their ideas because, as you said, employees are closer to the work that they're doing, so they're going to have ideas about how to make it better. And at the same time, this is a new first-time leader, and so they're not exactly certain how to react to or how, to ideas that are shared, or more generally, how to foster an environment where that voice is, encouraged. Like just as an example, of maybe what's going through this employee or this leader's mind. Not all ideas are great. Sometimes employees bring ideas that aren't that good. So how do you react to that? Maybe it's not a great idea, but do in a way that doesn't squelch future voice.
Absolutely.
Or so I've given a lot there, but any kind of reaction to what advice you would give to a new manager wanting to foster a culture or climate where voice is encouraged?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think, one of the things that we talk about uh, as an institution is to make it an institution of learning. And I think when you learn, you think back, and sometimes I think we make too much sometimes about our strategy and our environment, and sometimes things are even simpler. But you think about your greatest teachers. Your greatest teachers were able to develop trust. They were able to develop this sense of even if things fail, it's okay. It's about learning and it's about trying to determine what those best solutions are.
Mhm.
I think, Tim, to what you said about uh, new leaders, you're going to make mistakes. And if you're not ready for them to make mistakes, and sometimes you have to be willing to even let them step into that pothole because you know that they're going to learn somewhere along the line. And that to me is probably just as important as anything else. You have to be willing to allow people to make mistakes if they learn and they start to build that confidence. Um, as you said, there's a balance. You don't want this critical mistake to happen, but also to believe in the process.
Mm.
And I think good teachers don't just let people go out and make mistakes. They lead them through that process. They build them and they build those skills as they go forward. And I think that's really what's critical. I think as you talk about leadership, people also forget that everyone has their own belief in leadership. And I will struggle with that word leadership, but I always believe that leaders have a greater responsibility, not just about being a leader, but creating better leaders for the future.
Mm.
And that's the environment we want to create. How do you develop that next generation of leaders? There's a big belief that we have, and it's a critical belief, is to look at 7 generations into the future.
Mm.
And that's one of the things that is critical with Seneca Gaming Corporation, as really being part of the Seneca Nation. We'll always be here. And we always have to look at 7 generations into the future. And if you do, that's why we want to develop these leaders.
Yeah.
We can't just be worried about the immediate. We have to be thinking about the long term.
Yeah.
And that to me is really how you develop, and it's critical to leadership. I mean, the one thing I will say is for leaders, I think one thing I've never learned until probably the last few years is how important it is to network, to look at other leaders, and regardless if it's in business, the arts, the music, uh, whatever area, and to pick off these little pieces of lessons that can be learned and leverage those as you go through. I
Yeah.
mean, I think there's a lesson for leadership everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah. Sure. I like a lot of things that you've talked about here. So the research evidence is pretty clear too, that and lines up really well with what you're saying there in terms of the focus being on learning as opposed to being absolutely right in this moment. That if the some organizations will cultivate kind of an environment where we're going to punish exceptions. Like, so if you fail, we're going to punish that, because we don't want to have mistakes. And the learning orientation is kind of the opposite of that, which is that we're going to focus on getting better and building and improving and developing. And what's really fascinating about that is that it does give employees sort of the creative space to come up with ideas, and then also the comfort level, the safety, psychological safety is what we refer to it as, to be willing to speak up, because they know that, yeah, if it's not perfect, this idea that I'm sharing, that I won't be ridiculed, I won't be punished, there won't be negative consequences that will come to me as a result of speaking up and sharing. Another thing that struck me about your comment is that thinking into the future, 7 generations, and building a leadership pipeline, so to speak, that encouraging voice is a big part of that, actually. So, frontline employees, someday there's a potential that they're going to be executives in the company,
Absolutely.
in future generations. And if there is no room for them to be involved in the decision-making process, to give input, to learn to weigh and consider issues and so on, where are they going to learn these skills? I think those two things go together quite nicely.
hmm And I think, part of it's exposure. I think, I think we've made strides to get more exposure,
Yeah.
to be provided leadership opportunities, to be able to see where these decisions can be made, where they can be impacted. And it's funny. I think we've even tried to implement that for our senior management team.
Hmm.
So one of the things we recently went through, and it's been difficult through COVID. I think not as we've come out of COVID, though. One of the things we had anticipated to do, and we're in the process of doing, is rolling out a revised mission, vision, and value statement. And we had done a lot of work on this prior. But one of the things we stopped and we approached was I always chuckled because I would think to myself, "Oh, it's kind of insane when you think about it that one person at the top of the organization could say, this is how you're going to do it, and try to talk to 3,000 people. Well, you know what they're going to say? Yeah, like you know what I'm going through. So a much better approach would be, well, what do these, what do the constituents think, your team members? So one of the ways we try to do this is actually to build our mission, vision, and values by incorporating it by our directors first. So they actually built our mission, vision, and values. As they built that work up, we actually worked with them from the senior management team to really develop what I feel is a much more organic, a much more, to me, mission, vision, and value statement that is one that they believe in and one that they can lead, because now it's not a question of, well, you're telling me what it is. No, you own this.
Yeah.
And when you have a not only leadership, but ownership of it, you have a lot more investment.
How far into the organization did that extend in terms of the seeking of input? So for the vision, mission, and value statements, um, did that go, the executive team, of course, but did it even go further in terms of gathering inputs?
Yeah, actually, as we've gone through the inputs, has been developing those. And so part of what we've always tried to look at doing is to develop tools. And I'm really a big believer in data-driven decisions.
Yeah.
So let's get the data out there. And that's really a big piece. Like, it's very easy to do, well, what's your budget? And there's so many times it's like, well, you're over budget or you're under budget. Well, I'm like, that's easy to tell. But what's the experience of your customers? And people forget too that your customers aren't just your patrons from the external. It's your team members.
Sure.
Right? And specifically, if you look through like some disciplines, HR, IT, their customers, our team members are our customers. And overall, if we don't have our team members aren't happy, well, how can you expect them to provide a great customer experience if they're unhappy in delivering that?
Yeah.
I think, you know, I certainly am humble enough to realize I don't have all the answers, but I know many of our folks, and when we work collectively, we can come up with the best decision we can do going forward.
Yeah.
I think humility is a big factor.
Yeah. In fact, there's now emerging research on the importance of leader humility and fostering that environment where employees do feel comfortable to share their inputs. And so when you were putting together that vision mission statement, I'm curious, and you were asking employees throughout the organization to share what was important to them, their values and so on, and bring that, like you said, in sort of an organic way so that you had, instead of a top down, hey, this is our vision and mission,
Yeah.
but that the vision and mission reflected the values of the employees. How did you gather that information? Was it through like surveys? Was it through just talking to people? How did you go about discovering it? Yeah.
Well, one of the things we did, and it was really a part of that vision was, you know, uh, when we talk about this, a lot of what was driven also was from our Seneca culture. So we knew that we wanted certain, you know, we wanted to have inclusion.
Yeah.
We wanted to have this long-term vision. We could, you have that feel. Right? That sounds kind of, 10,000 feet in the air. But we knew that there was this feel, and we brought in a consultant. And you know how I knew we were in trouble? When I asked, I said, where's our last mission, vision, and values? And you know what I got for a response? I had 15 different mission, vision, and values. If you have 15 different visions, we got a slight issue here. So we want to get down to one and make it simple. And we brought in a consultant, more of a facilitator, to work in a group setting to really bring it about. And that I think is very important, to really look for consensus to build it. The part that we didn't even realize it was going to occur, and it did, was also part of this belief, and it was part of our, what we call the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, that as an individual arrow, right, you're strong, But if you group together 5 additional arrows and you bring those and you bind those together, they're unbreakable.
Mm.
And that was part of it. We're stronger as a team
Mm.
than as one individual. And that to me was, part of that.
Mm.
And, I think when we talk about leadership, we realize that leaders can be anywhere in your organization. It doesn't have to be executive leadership. There are leaders throughout this organization, and we need to foster them and celebrate them as we go forward.
Yeah. The sense that I get is that the organization is a very strong organization from a collective standpoint, that everybody identifies strongly with the mission and the values and so on of the organization. And that there's a strong team aspect, that instead of like operating individually, people understand the importance of working together as a group in a cohesive way to accomplish organizational objectives. Sometimes that can result in people not willing to speak up and share because they don't want to disrupt what they see as kind of the status quo. That's too strong a word, but does that make sense what I'm saying? Like,
Sure.
how to get people to be willing to be a part of the collective, part of the group, but also be willing to stand up and say, I love this organization, and there are some things we could fix and improve. Does that make sense what I'm saying? There's kind of a tension between those two things.
Yeah, it's also tough. It, maybe it's difficult. I think I get what you're saying. One of the things too is that if you develop leaders and you develop that leadership, one of the most difficult things is, I think, if you're doing it right, you're going to come to a crossroads where some of your individuals may outgrow your organization.
Mm.
And there has to be a realization that that can happen. Um, if that does, we also have to celebrate the growth of the individuals.
Mm.
And I think sometimes folks, I remember this time when I would always be, I was in a different organization, and I would say, well, we always have to be ready that if somebody were, say, if I were to step out of my role, is somebody else going to be ready?
Mm.
And I would always try to make sure that you would be preparing somebody to step in, succession planning.
Mm.
And I'll never forget, somebody said to me once, well, you're crazy. If you do that, you're just forcing yourself out of a job. And I'm like, yeah, but that doesn't make sense, right? For a long-term goal, for stability, you need to develop your leaders. You need to have them prepared to step in. And I never forgot about that. And I remember I would always think to myself, well, maybe I am crazy. But I do believe, that that's part of that leadership, is to be that teacher
Mm.
and to realize, that that needs to be rewarded.
Mm.
So that as much as you have your team, and I'm a big Bills fan. We're in Buffalo country. But you know what? It's not one star that wins games.
Mm.
It's a team that wins games.
Mm.
And you can never lose sight of that. That it's great to celebrate individual success, but you need to share that with team success.
Mm. Yeah.
Go Bills too.
Yeah. Go Bills. Yeah, I love that. Sort of that, the importance of, and tying it into the importance of belonging to the team, and keeping the focus on the organizational outcomes as opposed to, what might be more self-interested behavior or action on the part of any individual. So I'm just going to ask one last question, as we kind of wrap up. By the way, this has been tremendously enjoyable for me, so I hope it has been for you too.
Oh, it's been great. I can't say enough. This is wonderful.
So one last question. As I came into the building today,
Sure.
I checked in with the security person downstairs, and you met me there, and you knew the name of the security guy at the front desk.
Sure, Michael.
Michael. And it struck me then that, as I was thinking about what we're going to be talking about today, the importance of relationships. And I think that's kind of, I suspect you would agree with the importance of building and cultivating supportive relationships inside the organization that then would lead to an environment where people feel comfortable speaking up and sharing
Mm.
their opinions and thoughts. Can you tell me just a little bit more about how, as an executive, you go about helping young leaders develop that relationship orientation so that they are cultivating the kinds of relationships that will foster speaking up and voicing concerns, raising issues, and so on?
Yeah, it's interesting. That's one of the things I absolutely love about participating in this program. W- We've been able to really leverage this as one aspect, is to really get our team members to invest in them. So that might be learning opportunities. It might be we do like a mini MBA program. And when people actually get pulled into a program, I think they quickly say, wow, you're interested in my growth. Well, you build that confidence. I remember always being a little nervous myself as I would go through different growth, and it's important to look back at what you've gone through. And I always think about who are my greatest teachers, and to remember I wouldn't be where I was at if I didn't have that same investment. And I think to really, it is simple, but I always think it's so important to develop this fundamental bond with people.
Mm.
And going back to what you said, just getting to know somebody's name and take the time to stop and understand what their interests are and mean it, to be genuine, and to listen. That to me is one of the biggest things. And I thought about this before we did this, before we got together, and I started thinking, you know, I think every day you have to think about what's going to be my next focus on leadership. And you know what I thought about is to be an effective listener. People get concerned about how you communicate, but they forget sometimes that it's just as important to how you listen and how you interpret what people say to you. And maybe that was my lesson for today, but it was a good thing.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. To take a personal interest in other people, and I think that filters down through an organization. We
Absolutely.
take our cues from people who are uh, leaders in the organization, and lower level leaders take their cues from that.
Hmm.
And so I think that's a great place to kind of wrap up our conversation. I feel like I've learned a lot, and about cultivating an environment where people are willing to share their thoughts and inputs and speak up and share concerns and so on, and be empowered
Hmm.
to be a full member of the organization. And I think that that last spot where that last thought you just shared about listening, and related to an earlier comment about being humble and open, both are important elements in that. So with that, I think we'll conclude. This has been uh, an installment of the 52 Weeks of Leadership through the Center for Leadership and Organizational Effectiveness. Um, and with that, we will close.
Well, thank you very much.